Okay, I'm going to show off some of the techniques and node setups that I use for lighting. These are some different things you can do to retain as much control over your image as possible and still take advantage of the natural beauty of cycles. If you have any questions, I'll be active in the comments below, and if you need any 3D work, editing, or sound design, my email is on screen. The first thing I'll cover is going to be the most general piece of advice, which is to expand upon the basic 3-point lighting that you've probably heard of. 3-point lighting is fine and a good place to start, but I personally think that it's most useful in interview-style portrait shots, and in reality, you'll need to do a lot more than that in most of your Blender work. So I'm going to show you in this little example scene how you can get a much nicer result with just a few more lights and a couple techniques that I'll go into detail on later in the video. This shot here is done with just 3 lights, a key, a rim, and a fill, with a little bit of support from the practical lights, in this case being the dawn glow outside and the table lamp. This result is okay. The key light comes from the windows through the curtains, the rim helps define the character's shape, and the fill light brightens up the darkest bits so that we can always see the subject. But we can do a lot better than this. This redone version uses 9 lights and in my opinion looks much better. There's a dedicated background light casting a more convincing dawn glow across the room evenly. The key light for the character has no undesired impact on the surroundings behind him, and while there is still a rim light from the window, it's actually made up of 2 different lights to achieve the precise shape that I wanted. Then there's 2 more orange rim lights on the opposite side, which are to further define the shape of the character and incorporate him further with his surroundings. Then there are 3 different lights that create the glow from the lamp on the table, and there is still a fill light to ensure that the darkest parts of the character remain lit. I'm going to get into some of the techniques that make this possible, and bounce around a few other scenes as well to show you cases where you might actually use them. Light linking is a simple way in Blender to include or exclude specific objects or collections from specific lights. You can do this by selecting your light, accessing the Object Properties panel, and going to Shading, Light Linking. Here you can make a collection that houses anything you want to affect. These weird ghost collections don't clutter up your view layer, but they can be found in the Blender file window if you want to clean them up at any time. Just make sure you have your light selected and then drag whatever object you wish to affect into the collection in the panel. You can then flip the checkbox back and forth between include or exclude. The only light that will still be affecting the object is bounce light, which we'll talk more about later. In our sample scene, this is how I separated the room lighting from the character lighting. The area light to the side of the scene is told not to cast rays on anything inside the character collection, and the opposite is true for any of the lights that affect the character exclusively. The light distance control node is probably the most useful thing I can offer. Select your light, and in the shader editor, enable the use of nodes. You can then copy the nodes on screen. I might release a node preset pack down the line. It's a simple node setup that basically makes your light's rays either emit or appear transparent as controlled by this multiply node. Hold shift to slowly increase the multiply value and see its effects. You can adjust the closeness and intensity of the color ramp values to alter the fall off as well. I use this setup on nearly every light that I make. In our sample scene, maybe you want the orange rim light to only affect the closest side of the character, or you want the window light to drop off at a specific spot in the frame. Maybe you want finer control over a street lamp, or a particularly short and bright point light. All of that is done through this setup, and it can be used in combination with any of the other concepts in this video for a ton of different purposes. I use this setup all the time. Next, I'll show you how I improved this outdoor scene's lighting without actually spawning any lights. This scene is lit almost entirely by the sky texture, the default Nishida sky. The main change that I made to the foreground was by using a bounce card. Bounce cards are used all the time on film sets and in traditional animation. In Blender's case, it can be a completely untextured plane. The front of this crate was too cold and dark for my liking, so I stuck a big white plane off to the side, which was enough to fix that and also cast some additional light onto the subject itself. A bit of flexibility that we have thanks to this not being real life is that we can actually put these planes inside the shot, maybe even casting light without being visible themselves. In the background I did just that. The shadows of the trees are lit up by 3 different planes. This one fixes a big ugly shadow on the floor, this one pulls up the darkest bits of this tree, and this one bounces some light back towards the underside of these 2 trees. For any you may have that are directly inside the shot, you go to Object Properties, Visibility, Ray Visibility, and disable the camera rays. So now you keep the effect of its bounce lighting and illumination, but remove the plane itself from view. You can then change the viewport visibility as well to appear more like an area light does. If you make the plane emit its own light, this works as a sort of hybrid area plus point light. This ad also used a Gobo texture to create fake leaf shadows, which can be applied in a few different ways, sometimes in the light nodes themselves, but in this case it's just another floating plane up in the air with a Voronoi texture crushed and plugged into the alpha channel. Then I animated the texture's location coordinates to sway around slowly, and the end result is that the plane blocks some sunlight and appears as leaves. Constraints are used all the time in animation, but I've found that they have a purpose in lighting as well. In this case, I've got a scene where the lights are set up just how I like them, but as the shot plays out, the character spans a large amount of space. The orange light to the right of the frame is almost completely unused by the time he walks over here and turns around. So if we go to the Constraints tab for that light and set up a Track 2 constraint, as long as you set the proper axis and select the correct object, you can force the light to always point at whatever object you need, as if somebody on set is controlling it. The last thing I want to mention here is the Max Bounces slider. You might be familiar with the Max Bounces section under the render panel, but you actually have individual control of this value per light. Under the green light bulb panel, you can set an individual maximum for how many times a light is able to bounce off of its surroundings. 0 max bounces essentially disables path tracing, while 1 or higher allows the light to bounce around surfaces with increasing accuracy. I used it here in this ad for a barbecue sauce. Way in the back of the scene, I had a ladder in a corner and I just thought it was too dark. All I really wanted to do was refine the shape of the ladder without causing any undue illumination and attention to this corner of the scene. So I used 2 narrow area lights with 0 bounces. You might also lower the max bounces for the sake of optimization, like I did in our sample scene from before. In this case, there's just no reason for this tiny rim light to even be trying to bounce at all, especially when the closest nearby materials are fairly complex. Any bounces wouldn't be visible in the first place, and any attempt to create them is just going to needlessly increase our render time. In this scene, none of the 4 rim lights provide any bounces at all. Do be sure to provide the scene as a whole with a healthy amount of bounces though. The renderer needs light rays to calculate samples, and not having enough will cause fireflies and other undesired noise artifacts in the darker parts of your scenes. I do plan to go into this further in a dedicated video about render settings, so subscribe to catch that when it drops. I've managed to squeeze some decent renders out of just a GTX 1070. That's all I've got for this video though. Like I said, if you have any questions or feedback about any of the things that I talked about in this video, you can leave them in the comments below. And if you need any work, I am available at the email on screen yet again. Thanks for watching, peace out.